For more than 3,000 years, one civilization dominated the northeast corner of Africa, building monuments so enduring that they still capture the world's imagination today. And its story begins not with kings, but with a river. Nearly everything about ancient Egypt starts with the Nile, which rises far to the south near Lake Victoria and travels thousands of kilometers north through desert and floodplain, before splitting into a wide delta and emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. It's one of the longest rivers on the planet, and for the people who settled along its banks it was effectively the entire world, since Egypt itself receives almost no rainfall, and the landscape beyond the river is unforgiving desert in every direction. The ancient Egyptians divided their world accordingly, calling the fertile black soil deposited by the river's floods the Black Land, associated with life and order, while the surrounding desert was the Red Land, a place of chaos and danger. And because they thought of geography in terms of the river's flow, their sense of direction was essentially reversed from ours, with what we'd call south being up, toward the river's source, and north being down, toward the sea. Every year, monsoon rains falling far away in the Ethiopian highlands caused the Nile to swell and overflow its banks, depositing a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain. And this flood was so reliable that Egyptians built their entire calendar around it, dividing the year into a flooding season, a growing season, and a harvest season, while too little flooding meant famine and too much brought destructive damage. So they built measuring stations called Nilometers along the river to anxiously track whether the harvest ahead would bring abundance or hardship. Humans have lived along the Nile for an extraordinarily long time, with stone tools found in river sediment going back hundreds of thousands of years, and modern humans arriving in the region tens of thousands of years ago, likely following the river as a natural corridor out of Africa. And over thousands of years, cycles of wet and dry climate pushed people back and forth between a lush Sahara and a barren one, until the desert dried out for good, and the people living there had nowhere left to go but the riverbank, where scattered farming communities gradually grew into towns and eventually into two rival kingdoms, one in the south, upstream, and one in the north, near the delta. Around 3000 BC, a ruler from the southern kingdom of Thinis named Narmer changed the course of history when, according to the fragmentary evidence that survives, he conquered the northern kingdom and united the two lands under a single crown, a union that kicked off a system of writing, government, and monumental architecture that would define Egyptian civilization for the next 3 millennia. Egyptian hieroglyphs appear in the historical record already remarkably sophisticated, suggesting the writing system may have been deliberately designed rather than slowly evolved, and Egyptian rulers eventually became known by the term Pharaoh, though that label wasn't actually applied to kings until many centuries after Narmer's reign. Narmer's successors built a new capital called Memphis at the strategic point, where the Nile's floodplain meets the delta, and it would remain one of Egypt's most important cities for the rest of its ancient history. Early Egyptian kings were buried in mud-brick tombs, but this changed dramatically under a king named Djoser, whose reign kicked off what we now call the Old Kingdom, and whose chief architect Imhotep, a brilliant and multi-talented official, is credited with designing the world's first large-scale monument built entirely of cut stone, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, which began as a simple stone tomb and grew tier by tier into a soaring 6-layered structure that was likely the tallest building on Earth at the time. Not every pyramid project succeeded, and several of Djoser's successors died before their own monuments could be completed, leaving half-finished pyramids scattered across the desert as a reminder that these projects had to be finished within a ruler's lifetime, since work rarely continued once a king had died. It was a king named Sneferu who perfected the classic pyramid shape we recognize today after his first attempt collapsed during construction, and his second attempt began sinking into unstable ground and had to be finished at a shallower angle, giving it an odd bent profile that still stands, before his third attempt finally succeeded as the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history. And his son Khufu took this ambition to its absolute limit by commissioning the Great Pyramid at Giza. An almost unimaginable undertaking involving more than 2 million blocks of stone that rose nearly 150 meters into the sky and held the record as the tallest structure ever built by humans for roughly the next 3,800 years. Even though we know remarkably little about Khufu himself, beyond a tiny ivory statuette barely a few centimeters tall. Contrary to a persistent modern myth, historians no longer believe the pyramids were built primarily by enslaved laborers, and most evidence instead points to a workforce of skilled, paid craftsmen supplemented by farmers who worked seasonally on public projects when the fields were flooded and idle, organized into teams with proud nicknames, fed a diet that included regular meat and beer rations, and sometimes even honored with burial within the pyramid complex itself when they died on the job, a privilege never extended to slaves. Khufu's son Khafre and grandson Menkaure built their own pyramids alongside his at Giza, though each successive monument grew smaller than the last, and within just a century or so, the era of truly colossal pyramid building was already over. The Old Kingdom eventually crumbled under the long reign of a king named Pepi II, whose extraordinarily long life created a succession crisis, as regional governors increasingly passed power down through their own family lines, becoming independent lords, while around the same time a severe, centuries-long drought struck the wider eastern Mediterranean and crippled Egyptian agriculture, producing roughly 2 centuries of fragmentation known as the First Intermediate Period, a time of famine, banditry, and civil war, until a Theban king named Mentuhotep II finally triumphed over his northern rivals and reunified the country, ushering in what's known as the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is remembered less for grand monuments and more for a flourishing of literature, producing some of the earliest known works of fiction in human history. And it was also a period of expansion, as Egyptian kings pushed the empire's borders both north into the Levant and south into Nubia, building a chain of massive fortresses along the Nile's cataracts to secure their southern frontier. Though this period, too, eventually collapsed into chaos, culminating in the rule of Egypt's first fully titled female king, Sneferu, whose short reign ended without an heir. What followed was another era of fragmentation, worsened by what may have been one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history, and taking advantage of Egypt's weakness, a foreign people known as the Hyksos swept in from the east and seized control of the Nile Delta, bringing with them a military technology Egypt had never used before, the horse-drawn chariot, until Egyptian kings based once again in Thebes launched a war of liberation. Begun by a king named Kamose and finished by his son Ahmose, who drove the Hyksos out entirely and reclaimed the ancient pyramids at Giza, ushering in the New Kingdom, the era in which Egypt reached the height of its wealth, territory, and cultural influence, producing rulers such as Hatshepsut, one of the era's great female pharaohs, who commissioned major building projects and sponsored a celebrated trading expedition to a distant land known as Punt. Perhaps no New Kingdom ruler generates more fascination than Amenhotep IV, who came to the throne around 1350 BC, and partway through his reign abandoned Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of worshipping a single deity, the sun disk known as the Aten, changing his own name to Akhenaten, and effectively becoming the first monotheist in recorded history, shutting down temples to the old gods, defacing their names from monuments across the country, and building an entirely new capital city in the desert devoted to his new faith, where a grand ceremony marking the city's completion may have helped spread a deadly epidemic already sweeping through the wider Middle East, devastating his own family and likely the broader population. After Akhenaten's death, his religious revolution was quickly abandoned, and his young son changed his name from one honoring the Aten to one honoring the old god Amen instead, becoming the pharaoh we now know as Tutankhamun, who ruled only briefly and died as a teenager, but whose fame today far outstrips rulers who accomplished far more, largely because his tomb escaped the notice of grave robbers for over 3,000 years, until its rediscovery in 1922. Roughly 50 years after Tutankhamun, Egypt reached its peak under Ramesses II, who ruled for an extraordinary 66 years and became known to later history by his Greek name, Ozymandias, leading a major campaign early in his reign against the rival Hittite Empire that culminated in the famous Battle of Kadesh, a battle he nearly lost after riding ahead of his main army into an ambush, but ultimately turned around through reinforcements and considerable personal daring. A conflict that eventually ended not in decisive victory, but in one of the oldest surviving written peace treaties in history, a copy of which is still displayed today at the United Nations headquarters. Ramesses spent the rest of his long reign on massive building projects, inscribing his name so deeply into stone across Egypt that more of his monuments survive than those of any other pharaoh, and also founded a new delta capital named after himself. Ramesses II's extraordinarily long reign created the same succession problems that had plagued earlier long-lived kings, and his eventual successor Merneptah had to repel an invasion from Libya reinforced by mysterious raiders from across the Mediterranean later historians would call the Sea Peoples, marking the beginning of a period of dramatic upheaval across the entire eastern Mediterranean world, likely worsened by a new round of severe drought whose causes remain debated by historians today. Ramesses III, who came to power roughly a century later, faced the Sea Peoples in their most serious assault yet, setting a trap at the mouth of the Nile that lured their fleet into an ambush of hidden archers and soldiers, and won a decisive victory, making Egypt one of the few societies to successfully repel this wave of invasions that had already toppled other great civilizations of the era, including the Hittite Empire. Though Egypt's economy never fully recovered as the region's long-distance trade networks had been shattered, and late in his reign Ramesses III was assassinated in a palace conspiracy organized by one of his secondary wives hoping to place her own son on the throne, a plot that was ultimately crushed, but that marked the beginning of a long, slow decline as a string of increasingly powerless kings, many of them also named Ramesses, presided over a kingdom gradually losing authority to a new power. The wealthy and increasingly independent priesthood of the god Amun in Thebes. With central authority crumbling, real power passed into the hands of regional priests in the south and Libyan-descended dynasties in the north, while to the south, the Nubian kingdom of Kush, long dominated by Egypt, had grown wealthy and powerful in its own right, enthusiastically adopting Egyptian religion and culture even as native Egyptian authority weakened, until Nubian kings eventually conquered Egypt outright, founding what's known as the 25th dynasty, and even reviving the practice of pyramid building on a smaller scale in their own homeland. This Nubian dynasty soon collided with the era's rising superpower, the Assyrian Empire, and although Egypt's Nubian king Taharqa fought off an initial Assyrian invasion, a larger force soon returned, sacked Memphis, and eventually captured and devastated Thebes itself, a blow from which Egyptian prestige never truly recovered. In the centuries that followed, Egypt passed through the hands of one foreign power after another, conquered by the Persian Empire, then by Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Greeks, whose Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, while largely maintaining Greek language and customs, a dynasty that came to an end with its final ruler, Cleopatra, whose death in 30 BC marked the definitive close of independent Egyptian rule as the country was absorbed into the Roman Empire. Egyptian religious and written culture didn't vanish overnight, and traditional worship persisted for centuries at isolated temple sites even as the wider Mediterranean world converted to Christianity. But the very last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 AD at a temple on an island near Aswan. And not long after, the temple itself was closed and converted into a church, bringing thousands of years of continuous religious and written tradition to an end. with knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs gradually lost entirely, not to be recovered again until scholars finally deciphered the script many centuries later. Ancient Egypt's history spans a scope that's genuinely difficult to comprehend, since by the time Cleopatra died, the Great Pyramid was already more ancient to her than she is to us today. And few civilizations in human history have matched Egypt's endurance. Few are still leaving behind monuments capable of humbling visitors thousands of years after they were built. With the pyramids, born from ambition, engineering brilliance, and the labor of countless ordinary people, still standing as one of the most powerful reminders in existence of both what human civilization can achieve and how, in the end, even the greatest empires eventually fade.